Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's beer review, we're jumping into a couple of barrel-aged barley wines. This is going to be a fun one for me. Two brewers we've had multiple beers from before. First barley wines I've ever had from both. So we're going to be starting with Kettle Brewing Company. This is called Bred, part of their barrel-aged series. This is indeed a bourbon barrel-aged barley wine. 10.5% ABV on this one. They're based in Denver, Colorado. Beer number two, this is going to be from Reuben's Brews. This is called Ryes Men. It is a whiskey barrel-aged barley wine that was brewed with multiple different types of rye. This one clocks in at 13.7% ABV. They're based in Seattle, Washington. So two barrel-aged barley wines, one specifically bourbon, one whiskey barrel. A little bit of a gap in the ABV range here, but both bringing barrel-aged goodness to the barley wine game. So I'm very much looking forward to jumping into these, and I'm going to do exactly that. We're going to start with Kettle Brewing Company's Bred, the bourbon barrel-aged barley wine that clocks in at 10.5% ABV. Okay, jumping into the first beer of today's barrel-aged barley wine review, we've got Kettle Brewing Company's Bred. This one's bourbon barrel-aged. They're based in Denver, Colorado, 10.5% ABV on this one. This is part of their barrel-aged release series. It does mention specifically on the back, this is a limited release. There were only 125 cases of this one produced. I feel quite fortunate to have got my hands on one. As is typical with Kettle, they've got a very coppery colored label design here. As for Bred, it's got what looks like a woman walking her pet dogs on there. So we're just gonna set this down and get this cracked gently. All right, that was a gentle crack, and we're gonna pour this right into the glass. All right, ooh, okay, so this one's one of those lighter colored barley wines. It's in the range, but it is a little less common to have this kind of caramelly color tint. They tend to be quite a bit darker brown than this, but that's okay. All right. Yeah, visually that's very caramel colored. That's very caramel colored. This is among the lightest colored barley wines I've ever seen, but it is what it is. I can tell you it's got a very pronounced aroma. I can smell it from here. It does smell very much strongly of barley wine as well as that bourbon barrel. So let's get right up over it, see if we can detect specifics. Yeah, absolutely. There's some classic fig undertones, and certainly apricots are coming through, and you can absolutely smell that bourbon. Those are the big three aromas I'm getting out of this. Yeah, it smells quite nice. It's got this lighter, fruitier kind of aroma to it. So you never really know what you're going to get once you jump in, but I've got a pretty good idea just based on what they threw in here. So without further ado, let's jump in and see what this one's about. Okay, so yes, the bourbon comes through very, very clearly. It does come through up front, and as I anticipated, this one has a very pronounced caramel and toffee malt bill flavor to it. Very caramel forward, very toffee flavored. It's almost candy-like in its presentation. But as I could pick up in the aroma, it did translate into flavor of this one. There was this classic underlying flavor of figs and also apricots in this one that you get in many, many barley wines. Figs are very common. Apricots, they're relatively common. Figs typically are a flavor and aroma that comes through in most barley wines, if I'm fair. Dates are also pretty common. There's a suggestion of that in this. It's not that strong. It is namely kind of an apricot and fig side to the fruit that are coming through. In terms of that malt bill, though, that's what's really far more present. It's really bourbon kind of on top, especially on the front side. Then that malt bill comes in, and then that kind of overtakes the bourbon, and then they're kind of hanging out, and then all of these other fruit flavors kind of blend in to the middle. It's very nice. It's very much a classic barley wine. Just this one, you know, with a much more pronounced caramelly and toffee-like malt bill. And this is obviously due in large part to the quantity and the depth of roast on the malts. Using these lighter caramelly colored ones, it is typically going to come through more strongly like that. In fact, I wouldn't be shocked if they specifically did use some kind of caramel or carapils malt base in here, because it really does come through quite nice. The toffee side of that, though, they're distinctly different flavors, caramel and toffee. They're obviously related, but they are distinctly different. This is very much like a candied buttered toffee flavor that comes through, and it's really, really quite nice. It reminds me of a confection that I had many, many times in my youth. Very, very good. I'm a big fan of this one. I really like the way this tastes and how the flavors balance together. There's a little bit of everything, and it all comes through very bold and very clearly. I'm going to jump back in for body and mouthfeel and think on the flavor development a bit more. Body on this is really just kind of a medium heavy. The body isn't as big and robust as you would anticipate, but the mouthfeel is quite resistant. It's quite resistant. It's not syrupy, but it definitely has a good bit of viscosity to it. It's thick. It's got a thickness about it. So the mouthfeel is quite a bit more robust than the body on this one. In terms of the finish on this one is maybe a little bit longer than average, high end of average to slightly above, but it's not ridiculously long. And really what you're left with at the end of the sip on this one is lingering bourbon and the malt bill, both of which are quite intense in this beer, those flavors, and they're really, really good. So having those linger out and give you a little extra bit of length on the end of the finish is not a bad thing for my money. And I'm going to come back to this. I really like the balance that they struck in here. Getting proper, good quality barrels, aging for a requisite amount of time, putting together a really good malt bill, and then just getting it right. And this is the result, and it's fantastic. I'm going to take my time, sip on this, call it my scores. When we come back, we will get to the second beer of today's barrel-aged barley wine review. That is Reuben's Brews 3 Ryes Men. That one clocks in at 13.7% ABV. Okay, now jumping into the second beer of today's barrel-aged barley wine review, we have got Reuben's Brews 3 Ryes Men. 13.7% ABV on this one. It's been brewed with multiple different types of rye and then whiskey barrel-aged. Reuben's Brews is based in Seattle. So this is maybe the fourth or fifth beer I've had by Reuben's Brews. All of them that I've tried have been different styles, and they've all been fantastic, so I've got very high hopes. As you notice, we've got a classic wax dip. So we're pulling out our pointy tip bottle opener here. Same as always, we're just going to score deeply under the edge of the cap all the way around. And that is going to let us get under here. So hopefully on first attempt, we can just pry this cap right off. It usually works. So here we go. Yep, and that one came off no problem. And it's really neat too. That's the Reuben's Brews. It kind of looks like pie. I don't know if the camera's picking that up, but they had that stamped into the wax dip on the cap. Very nice presentation for the bottle. Now, in terms of label art, it's just a very, very clean design. It's got kind of an orange, but it's got a sheen to it. So it's kind of foil-like on a maroon background. 3 Ryes Men. Looks very nice. I can tell you, this is a very pungent beer. The aroma, I can smell it from quite a great distance, and that's just out of the tiny little mouth of this. So this one does have a very pronounced aroma, and I can tell you it's a good mix of barley wine and whiskey aroma I was getting out of the bottle. So let's get this poured. Yeah, this one looks nice. This is still a little bit on the lighter end than you normally see for barley wine. It's still in that caramel range, but definitely darker than the prior. Barley wines are one of those styles that can kind of be all over the board. It really depends on how much malt's used. It's a barley wine, so the answer is a lot. And really much more so what type of malts that they're pairing with it, how deeply roasted and what the darkest roast and the concentration of that is. That's going to really be the main driving factor that dictates color. There's often a lot deeper roasts that are used in them. That's much more the norm, but they do kind of run all over the board. Just like we tried that black barley wine a couple months back. Really fantastic. First black one I ever had. It was pitch black. And there are some that are very, very light. And indeed, there are blonde barley wines. So they do kind of run all over the board. So it's hard. You know, I still just give everything a decent rating if it's in the spectrum. And really it is. Appearance is a hard category to judge. But nonetheless, yeah, this is deviating from the norm, but just a little bit. It's a very nice deep caramel brown, much more so than that lighter end of the spectrum. It looks really nice in the glass. This one pretty effervescent, and it formed a little bit of a head. I've got decent retention on the sides, and it's got a nice super fine creamy pad floating on top. You probably can't see that in the camera, but it did a pretty good job here. Let's give it a sniff right over the glass. Oh yeah. Okay. So this is exactly what I was getting out of the bottle, but it's a lot more clear just sniffing right up on the glass. It's big aromas of whiskey, and it's got tons of classic date and fig that are coming through, and then a ton of caramel and toffee coming through. So I'm expecting this is essentially going to be more or less run-of-the-mill barley wine here that's been whiskey barrel aged. And there's nothing about barley wine that is run-of-the-mill. It's really just an amazingly complex beer style. I can't think of another beer style that's this big and bold and complex. Just layers of flavor, the way it presents itself. It's huge. It's a huge beer style. It is my favorite, and I'm very fortunate I've been able to get my hands on many barley wines in the last few months here, all thanks to Tavour. So fellow barley wine fans, Tavour. I know they're hard to track down. Tavour cuts out the legwork for you, and from different brewers, and just amazing. So without further ado, let's jump right in and give this a sip. Oh, man. Oh, wow. Oh, wow. Ooh. Oh, I wish you could taste what I just tasted. That first sip is always very telling, honestly. I've had many barley wines over the years. This is hands down one of the best I've ever had. Hands down. It's got so many layers. The balance is just incredible. And the way that the layers stack, how they present themselves, and indeed other aspects outside of the flavor. This beer is just barley wine nirvana. It absolutely is. It absolutely is. I am so thrilled to have this in my possession. I wish I had ordered more bottles. This is the only one I have. That's a sad thing, because this is just fantastic. I should have known. Reuben's Brews has yet to let me down. And man, this is good beer. Okay, so first things first. What you get in the aroma, as is not always the case, but more often the case than not in a barley wine, what you're smelling is going to translate into the flavor. There's always hidden other flavors that are part of the fun of experiencing a barley wine, but this one is really well done, folks. The whiskey barrel is very present. It's very present. The classic date and fig flavors come through immediately behind that whiskey in just a big, beautiful, even 50-50 combination of caramel and buttered toffee in that malt bill. Underneath that, there are some underlying stone fruit characters. I'm getting kind of like pitted fruit, like peaches, apricots, but they're candied. It's like sugar and then caramelized with a creme brulee torch. Or even if you threw, chunks of different stone fruit into a creme brulee, that's the big vibe I'm getting. A lot of that's coming from this buttered toffee and caramel kind of mix, and then these other fruit undertones. It's positively delicious. And I cannot emphasize enough how absolutely spot on. I mean, I would go so far as to say it's flawless, the balance on this beer. The balance they struck between every bit of this malt bill, the ratios they chose, the barrel, the type of barrel, how long they left it in. This is just, it is as close to barley wine perfection as perhaps I've ever had. And I am loving everything I just experienced. So, now that we've talked about flavor, the body and the mouthfeel on this is freaking huge. The body is massive. It's very heavy. The mouthfeel is ridiculously thick and viscous, and it matches that massively intensive breadth, substantive body that it has. And so the body and the mouthfeel go very well in tandem, but it's one of the biggest bodies and most viscous mouthfeels I've had on a beer in far more than even recent memory. This beer is freaking huge. It's freaking huge. And I mean that. And that is not a negative. That's not a critique. That's a compliment. It's 13.7. This is a big, high ABV barley wine, and they're not being shy about this. I mean, this is just well pulled off. Another nice thing about this mouthfeel, when you agitate around the palate to really let the flavors cut around, see what you're getting into, it gets so silky, creamy. We're talking velvet. It is one of the most lush mouthfeels I've had on a beer, yet again, in far more than recent memory. I mean, I am having a hard time finding a fault with this beer. It is just absolutely, absolutely incredible. I'm going to jump in for another sip, think on this flavor development. Before I do, I can tell you the finish on this is quite long. It is quite long. That barrel is really doing a heck of a job extending the length. I mean, the flavors are big and bold and pungent, but that barrel is really lingering. That in tandem with the malt bill, that's really what you're left with. I can still taste it. It's been at least a minute, minute and a half. It's still lingering on the back of the palate. It's just going to get more intense. One more sip here, once more into the fray. Oh, man. Man, there was just nothing to not like about this beer. There's positively nothing to not like about this beer. On second sip, a lot of those rye elements are really making themselves known. Rye is very well known for imparting this kind of earthen and spicy quality to a beer. And they use multiple different types of rye. And that really comes in up front, and it pairs exceptionally well with that little bit of that boozy bite you get from the whiskey barrel. That's where the spice is coming in. It's almost peppery. That's almost the best way I can describe it. Rye is a very unique ingredient in beer. I absolutely love rye beers. I've brewed them at home myself, and they're delicious. This is just such a great recipe for a barley wine. I wish I had multiple cases of this. This beer is that good. I mean, I can't say enough good things about this. I legitimately can't. I drink a fair bit of barley wine. They are expensive. They are not the easiest beer to find, but every time it's a beer drinking experience, and this is an absolute fantastic beer drinking experience. I've had a lot of good beers in recent memory and not so recent memory. This one's high up that list. I mean, this is just, I'm going to come out and say it. It's one of the best beers I've ever had. I think the last time I had a beer that I felt that strongly about was probably an Ommegang. I don't remember the name, maybe Three Philosophers. I'd have to research my notes, but this is just transcendent. This is a beer to which all other beers wish they could be. I mean, this is a yardstick beer. It's fantastic. Nothing about this I can critique. I mean, I am loving everything that they did with this. It was meticulously crafted, and they got it exactly right. Folks, I'm going to take my time sipping on this, enjoying every single last smidge of a drop in this beer. And when we come back, we will get both beers ranked from top to bottom. Okay, now that we've gotten to enjoy both beers, we're going to get them ranked, starting with Kettle Brewing Company's Bred. This is a bourbon barrel-aged barley wine that clocked in at 10.5% ABV. They are based in Denver, Colorado. So starting with the aroma on this one was huge, and it was a wonderful mix of classic barley wine aromas mixed with big pungency of that bourbon barrel. It was really fantastic, very, very pronounced. You do kind of expect that from this style and from barrel-aged beers in general, but this one did not let me down. It was top tier. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the taste, I absolutely loved it. This beer had all of the hallmarks of a classic barley wine, just the really complex layers of flavor, and you could pick all of them out independently, and they just kept swirling in and out of each other. And then, as so often is the case, that barrel aging was just the added bonus on top. I gave it a perfect 10 out of 10. For the body, 10.5% on a barley wine isn't huge. But it's not a low ABV for a beer at all. And frankly, I did expect at 10.5% the body to be quite robust. Barley wines typically are. This one was really just kind of hovering on medium, high end of medium. It was just high end of average, really. It gets a 6 out of 10. For the mouthfeel. The mouthfeel, on the other hand, was very much what I expected. It was very effervescent in the mouth, but it clearly had a ton of resistance, a lot of viscosity, which was really what I expected for the style. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. For the finish on this beer was longer than average, though admittedly not as long as I anticipated it would be. Given the pungency of flavor and the pungency and boldness of that bourbon barrel presence, I did expect all of those characteristics to really push out the end of the finish. And it was certainly above average for the style, but it wasn't top tier. It gets a 7 out of 10. For the head and retention, this is the one category that really it just didn't do well. It barely attempted to form a head, and it was gone as soon as it even attempted to start. It just gets a 1 out of 10. For the appearance on this one was not exactly standard for barley wine. They tend to be a little darker brown, but it was still in that spectrum, just more in the caramelly end. Gave it a 7 out of 10. For the balance of the ingredients on this beer was absolutely superb. All of the character traits of the malt bill that they put in there, plus the yeast strain that they chose to use, and the bourbon barrel, all of them came through independently and clearly. Gets a perfect 10 out of 10. Feeling in the intangible. Subjectively, I loved it. I thought this was an absolutely delicious barley wine, easily one I would order again and again. I give it a perfect 10 out of 10. Finally, as an example of the style. Okay, overall, in most of the really critical categories, this beer did exceptionally well. But it did lose a fair bit of points in a handful of categories and massive points in one of them. That being said, all things considered, head and retention really dinged the score pretty heavily just because it only got a 1. But in the grand scheme of things, that doesn't really affect the beer drinking experience. I still thought this was above average, taking everything into consideration. It gets a 7 out of 10, which brings the total score on Copper Kettle Brewing's Well Bred to a 78 out of 100. This is absolutely above average beer. And if we take that 1 out of the equation that it got for the head and retention, let's say it nailed it perfectly, it would have been an 88. So head and retention, is it that important in the grand scheme of things? Yes, for beers and beer styles, but the beer drinking experience itself, you could make a pretty strong argument, not really. So take it for what it is, but I thought it was excellent, and it is indeed well above average, one I would highly seek. Moving on to number 2. This was Reuben's Brews 3 Ryes Men, the multiple different type of rye and then whiskey barrel-aged barley wine. Quite a bit higher ABV at 13.7. That's a big one. They're based in Seattle, Washington. Starting with the aroma on this one was equally as pungent as the first, and you could smell all of the same character traits that you got on them. It's really what you come to expect from a barley wine. All these big, bold, pungent aromas, giving you an idea of what's in there, and then this nice whiskey back. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. For the taste, I absolutely loved it. The rye added this nice spicy, peppery quality to it, and it still had all of the classic flavors that you expect in a barley wine. They were all mingling, just as with the first one, and same thing again, just that whiskey barrel aging was just the cherry on top. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. For the body on this beer was huge. It was a big beer, and it felt big. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. For the mouthfeel, same story here. Big beer, a lot of viscosity. I mean, just a ton of viscosity. And I was just blown away by how just absolutely velvetly, silky smooth and creamy and lush the beer became when agitating around the palate. Perfect 10 out of 10. For the finish on this beer was absurdly long. I mean, easily a minute and a half after each sip, it's still just lingering all over the palate. It doesn't really get much better than that. 10 out of 10. For the head and retention, this one did a very, very good job. Well above average here. Sure, some still do better, that's okay. But this one for port at home, I was very impressed. It gets an 8 out of 10. For the appearance on this one was much closer to the standard darker brown barley wine, but it was still in the caramel range. Yes, it's in range, but it wasn't exactly standard. I docked 1 point here. It gets a 9 out of 10. For the balance on this beer was exceptional. Same as with the first one, and for the same reasons. All of the independent flavors came through perfectly clearly. They intermingled. Nothing was vying for attention. It was all there. Gets a 10 out of 10. Filling in the intangible. Subjectively, I thought this was easily among the best, if not the best barley wine I've ever had. And I mean that legitimately. I loved it. I gave it a 10 out of 10. Finally, as an example of the style. Big beer, done well. It only lost a handful of points in a couple categories that aren't super critical. I gave it top marks here. It gets a 10 out of 10, which brings the total score on Reuben's Brews 3 Ryes Men to a 97 out of 100. So, I mean, it's just top tier barley wine. If you're a barley wine and or barrel aged beer fan, this is one to get your hands on. I really wish I had picked up many, many more bottles of this than I did, because at first sip, I absolutely loved it. Folks, that's today's review. As always, I do sincerely appreciate you tuning in today. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to stay in the loop when our videos go live to YouTube, you can click the notification bell icon. It's right next to the subscribe button. Until next time, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.